Very glad she could come. It's Hannah Bradburn. She's a senior housing specialist at Lawstop. We're a firm of legal aid solicitors on the Stane, specialising among other things, housing and community care law. I'll hand over to Hannah.
Okay, so I'm just going to set a timer because I'm not quite as good as the rest of these guys at sticking to not just chatting. Okay, so I think the main issue that everyone knows right now is that property in Brighton, it's just not affordable. And why has that happened? So in particular since COVID, I think everyone knows that there's been an influx in the city, people moving in from London because they can now work from home. And what's that done for everyone else? Well, it's raised the prices. So what we're seeing at Lawstop is an increase in a number of things, some of those being evictions based on rent arrears because people can't afford their properties anymore, and also a rise in no-fault evictions because guess what, if your landlord thinks that they can get more money, they're going to kick you out and they're going to rent it to someone else who's going to pay more. So we heard obviously before about the local housing allowance rate, and what does that mean for everyone that lives in Brighton? So at the moment, a one-bed property on average, just 2 days ago, was going for £1,322 per calendar month. The local housing allowance rate for it is £797.81. That means as an individual, you have to find an extra £500 a month in order to pay your rent. Most people can't afford to do that. In particular, if you're on benefits, your universal credit allowance isn't even that. So all it's doing is pushing everyone further and further out of Brighton because they can't afford to stay here. The other issue that we're seeing a lot is an increase in disrepair, because if your city is oversubscribed and you can get more and more rent, you also don't really need to have your property at a particularly high standard in order to rent that out. So you'll see in Brighton and Hove there's hundreds and hundreds of properties that have mould issues, that have damp issues. I've never known a city to have so much single glazed properties as there is in this city. And again, it's causing people to have further health issues, and people can't really do very much about it. The other thing that we're seeing is a rise in unsecured tenancies. So people can't find tenancies in the usual ways because when they're going to viewings, they're being beaten out by other people. So people are turning up at viewings and other people are offering them 6 months in advance or 12 months in advance, or they've got guarantors, or they're just offering them more rent. So we're seeing a rise in property guardianships and also subletting. The issue with both of those is that when it comes to you being evicted, there's very little protection that you have. So what do we also see in respect to homelessness? So the issue is that the worse the quality of the city housing stock is, and the more expensive the city housing stock is, the worse it's going to be with individuals who are homeless, who are being placed into emergency accommodation. Because when the council place someone into emergency or temporary accommodation, the law quite clearly states that suitability has a big basis on the housing stock in your local area. So what that means is if Brighton housing stock is bad, Brighton Council are able to place you in subpar accommodation because that is the general housing stock. So what do we do at Lawstop? Basically, we're trying to challenge all of those things. So we work with evictions, we try and stop Section 21s, we try and stop Section 8, so that could be your possession cases, your ASB, and Section 21 is your no-fault evictions. We also work challenging issues with homelessness. So as Daniel mentioned earlier, the council, they like to say people aren't in priority need, they like to say people don't have a local connection, people are intentionally homeless. All of those decisions can be challenged, and sometimes it does take coming to a law firm or going to someone like Daniel for them to sort of listen and take some action. The other things that we do is we do also challenge a lot of issues with suitability. So just because someone says, well, the condition of the property is this sort of way, that doesn't mean we have to accept it. We can challenge that, and we do challenge that. One of the issues that is a huge problem, though, for us is we are a legal aid provider, and legal aid is getting smaller and smaller. So back in a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago now, the legal aid provisions got cut. And what that means is they reduced the amount of legal aid that's available in housing drastically. Disrepair, you can only get legal aid for disrepair is if your home is likely to cause death or serious illness. Now that's a very high threshold. Property in Brighton is very bad, but it probably doesn't meet that threshold. However, it is still available, but the issue is accessing it. So before 2018, Brighton and Hove had one legal aid provider. Right now, it has two. Considering, as you've just heard, the number of individuals that are homeless in Brighton compared to the rest of the country, that's quite shocking that there's only two legal aid providers here, and both are quite but it's slightly better than other parts of the country where there are advice deserts and people are having to travel sort of 70 miles to be able to speak to anyone about their housing issues. But it is getting slightly better. We're trying to change that. Lawstop, we've opened up 8 offices now. We opened in 2018 with 2 offices, and we now have 8 offices. We're trying to make it more accessible for individuals, and we have a lot of telephone appointments, in particular since COVID, because another thing that a lot of people probably know is it's very difficult if you're homeless to stick to an appointment because you can't charge your phone, you can't remember all the time to go somewhere because perhaps you need to be on the other side of the city at a food bank so that you can eat that day. So we're trying to make it as accessible as possible for people to come in and see us and speak to us or call us and speak to us. So as well as that, one of the things that we want to do is we want to move forward. So we at the moment have very much been challenging individual cases. So if you come to us and you're homeless, we'll challenge that. If you come to us and you're in unsuitable property, we'll challenge that. But one of the things that we definitely need to start challenging is the policies. So in COVID, we had one very successful case where we challenged Brighton and it actually changed the law across the whole country. So that was the case of N-Cube, which some of you may have heard, but it meant that all councils had to house everyone during the pandemic, even people that were no recourse to public funds. Since then, what we've done is we've actually hired a head of public law, and the intention is that we start moving into a place where we can start challenging real policies and start helping in a more central way rather than just individuals in a firefighting method, although we will still continue to do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That's amazing work. I'm really excited to hear what you're doing.
Anybody got a question for anybody?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, thank you all. And interesting to hear, you know, what you're talking about systemic change and policy change. So just like we are one of the co-secretariats for an APPG, which is an all-party parliamentary group on household and temporary accommodation. So we really agree that policy change needs to happen. We'd be interested to talk to anyone who wants to hear more about that. But Hannah, really, but also everyone else, you talked about addressing policy change, and I wondered what your thoughts are around that, like how you're thinking about going around about doing that, and also how we do that as a collective of people who have expertise and interest and lived experience, particularly in this area.
Thank you. So, I mean, in terms of how we do it, it's generally through judicial review. So taking it to the High Court and letting them decide that something's wrong. The way that we are sort of addressing certain things is we need a good test case usually. I know that sounds like an awful way of phrasing something, but it's the strongest circumstances that are going to make it the best and the most powerful. It's also then having a catalogue of individuals and cases and housing providers as evidence to show this is a systemic issue. So it's making sure that we take note of every single individual that comes forward, making sure that we keep records, and once we feel that we, have strong enough case, then we take all of those and we take it to the High Court. So I know, obviously, in Brighton and Hove there's tons and tons of issues, but I guess the worse the cases are, they definitely need to sort of come to sort of legal providers so that we can start to take note of them and start building cases so that we can actually then challenge it in the sort of legal setting. So I literally just wanted to add very quickly that I think one of the huge issues is that the council doesn't listen to the individuals that are presenting to them. I've spoken to a number of people who have said, please don't place me in a hostel because I'm a recovering addict and there's people in there that are doing drugs. If you don't listen to those people and you don't understand that they very much fear that they are going to go back to that same place, they are going to start experiencing those issues again, then it doesn't really sort of matter what else is sort of put in place, because this is just going to keep going. It's just going to be a revolving door of the same issues and the same problems. Obviously everyone's talked about Kendall Court, and it's the same thing with all of the emergency accommodation in Brighton. People are being placed in hostels that are hotbeds for similar issues, and it's not going to be addressed until individuals are listened to as individuals with specific needs and specific problems.
Well, we've got one more question, yeah?
It might be a short question because I think everybody has just said some of the questions that I was at. They've already answered them pretty much, but I just wanted to add some more comment, I guess, to the fact that I work for the Clock Tower Sanctuary. We support young people who are homeless and insecurely housed up to 26 actually, sorry. And like what we see with some young people, supported accommodation works very well for some young people. For some really traumatised young people, much as you were just describing, Hannah, like going into some of those settings with other traumatised young people who may be using drugs, especially if they're deemed high risk, and then they get put into adult supported accommodation, they get put into William Collier House, so their drug use escalates. It just isn't working. And also there's a lot of revolving door homelessness for some of these young people. They just can't cope in that kind of setting. Housing First is great. I've no idea how we get anyone referred into Housing First, because we've got young people who've been homeless since they're 16. They've been in and out of all of the supported accommodation settings in the city. They can't cope in there. I heard a story from one young woman the other day where she won't have a shower in her flat because she's got her own pod, like with a locked door, but she shares the facilities with another young woman who has her boyfriend round. And I mean, she doesn't say why, but she said she can't use the shower because if she hears the voice of the boyfriend outside, she just can't be in that space. We've had other young people in supported accommodation. They can't manage sharing facilities. They can't manage having food in a kitchen because they may have not had access to food when they were a child, so they hoard their food. There's so many reasons that people can't cope in these settings and they end up getting kicked out again. So that's one thing I think we need to think about, especially for young people, is having some alternatives for them that are more not independent, but supported living, but in their own space. Housing First is the model, really, isn't it? I mean, we just need more of that. We need it available for some young people who just can't cope. I think the other thing is, and I wasn't here for when you spoke, Helen, and I don't know who's coming next, so perhaps this has already been talked about, but there are some amazing examples of communities who have campaigned to take over spaces There's one in Brighton, I think, like up just off Lewis Road, where Bottega Rooms is. Audio Active has taken over the bottom, and then I believe that there's co-op flats above, which are more affordable, or are they guardianship? I don't know, but anyway, I know there's flats above. Also, there's a project in Hastings called in the Observer Building, where they have within the local community to try and prevent gentrification and local people being priced out of their city, because that's happening in Hastings now too. They've taken over a building and they've got 15 affordable spaces and they can have housing benefit there. There is a way, I think, if we rely on the government for systems change. I don't know. This is a unsympathetic government that we have, and it's all about profit, and it's all about them lining their pockets and the pockets of their cronies, as far as I can see. So I think there needs to be more of a community-led approach to trying to take over some of these spaces that might be going to property developers, and to get in there and to remake those spaces for communities, to remake affordable accommodation for those communities, community spaces where people can go. They don't, end up having to go to an artisan cafe to pay a £5 for a coffee, things like that. So more comments.
So I literally just wanted to add very quickly that I think one of the huge issues is that the council doesn't listen to the individuals that are presenting to them. I've spoken to a number of people who have said, please don't place me in a hostel because I'm a recovering addict and there's people in there that are doing drugs. If you don't listen to those people and you don't understand that they very much fear that they are going to go back to that same place, they are going to start experiencing those issues again, then it doesn't really sort of matter what else is sort of put in place, because this is just going to keep going. It's just going to be a revolving door of the same issues and the same problems. Obviously everyone's talked about Kendall Court, and it's the same thing with all of the emergency accommodation in Brighton. People are being placed in hostels that are hotbeds for similar issues, and it's not going to be addressed until individuals are listened to as individuals with specific needs and specific problems.